Contrast what Nehor was doing with verse 26 and 27 of chapter 1.
I think we see the church getting much stronger at this moment. Maybe one that, and we've talked about this before. We talk about their riches in verse 29, and we talk about them growing fat and rich and abundance, and yet you'll notice the language in verse 26. They were all equal, and they did all labor, every man according to his strength. So it produces this phenomenal success story. But usually those verses, you might expect something else at the end of those.
In fact, I like to read verse 29 part of it to my students and ask them without looking what the next verse says. And so I read this part that says that because of the steadiness of the church, they began to be exceedingly rich, having abundance of all things whatsoever they stood in need, and abundance of flocks and herds and fatlings and grain and gold and silver and precious things. And I say, what does the next verse say? And invariably they will say, they got proud, they became wicked. But verse 30 is an anomaly, isn't it? Because they don't get proud and wicked. In fact, they do something that's really rare in the Book of Mormon. They seem to stay rich and righteous
for a while.
Well, for almost 4 verses.
Which is good.
Yeah, which is good. Pretty good.
And it's wonderful to see the impact that now has because of their wealth, and they're not sending their heart on their wealth. They're not only able to bless the members of the church, but they reach out beyond the members of the church.
To the naked and the hungry and the sick, it says in verse 30.
But as a subtext to this story, if they were not doing that with those results, they're going to face their next major challenge in chapter 2. And had they not been prepared, maybe chapter 2 would read differently. Amlici might have succeeded. It might be a different end.
So let's talk about Amlici, the man who wanted to be king. Dana, as a Hebraist, talk to us about that name.
Right. Well, we would presume, based on what we have, that it's related to the word melech, to rule, right, to reign as a king, but you never can tell for sure, I would say.
It's kind of interesting that Hebrew root for a king is found in the name of the man whose great aspiration is to be king of the Nephites.
Well, and it also raises a pronunciation issue, and it could be Amalekai, it could be Amlici, and later we're going to meet a people called the Amalekites, and they might be these people. There's no known origin to them, so it's a tricky name.
It is interesting with regard to the Amalekites, as we have no introduction to them as a people. And that's one of the arguments that there is, that maybe this Amalekite is that same group.
Our pronunciation guide in the back of the text says Amlici. That's changed over the years, the pronunciation guide. In fact, the first pronunciation guide, it wasn't Jared, it was Jared. And I don't know if we'll ever know exactly how it's pronounced, but I think we ought to follow the convention just so everyone knows what we're talking about, and call him Amlici, who had a great desire to be the king. And when he's not chosen by the voice of the people, incites a civil war. What do you think? What's the doctrine that we need to point out and the principles from this event?
Well, one thing I think I see, and we have this great reform by Mosiah, and as Latter-day Saints living in a democracy, it's exciting. Give them their freedom, and a lot of them don't want it. It's too much, and as you had said, while Mosiah gives it to them, they'll increasingly limit it over time. And here's our first threat. You would think, oh, here it is, we have it, let's absorb it, but no.
Along with that, you see what strong personalities really can do. You see it with Nehor, you see it with Amlici, and you'll see it with people like Alma and others who are righteous, the long-term impact that they can have when they maintain the principles of the gospel versus those who bend it to their own needs and wants.
We find that when the Civil War starts, that Alma's quick to arm his people to defend their freedoms. And then, the second day of the battle, lo and behold, the Amlicites have joined forces with what just happens to be an invading Lamanite force the very next day. I used to read this and think, oh, what rotten luck. That here they have civil war, and at that very weakest moment, here come the Lamanites. But as I thought back through that, I thought, maybe this is God directing things, because there could have been some blessings with having the Amlicite rebellion come right at that moment. Because when the Lamanites did invade the land, here was Alma leading his forces already in the field, already mustered, already equipped, and already had already battle tested, and they're ready, prepared to meet the Lamanites. So I wonder if the Amalekites hadn't rebelled right then, if the Nephites would have lost even more.
You know, on the other side of that as well, certainly we don't know what's taking place among the Lamanites, but they may have seen the disruption within the government as an opportunity in gearing up and anticipating and move in at this time of discontent, this time of rebellion on the part of Amlici. And so when these two meet together, you really do have this challenge, this battle ready to take place. And how
What's interesting, that's right. What's interesting to me is our culture and our time period is so different. Here, chapter 2, verse 16, Alma being the chief judge and the governor of the people of Nephi, therefore he went up with his people at the head of his armies. We don't typically think of Latter-day Prophets leading the charge in battle, certainly a spiritual battle, but not out on the battlefield. But this would have been pretty common in their time period, in their culture. He's the leader, and so he's out there at the forefront.
It's a vivid picture that Mormon paints of the battle, isn't it? Here's Alma battling hand to hand with Amlici. They're both very weakened and almost like out of a Rocky movie. There's a break in the action, but he uses that time to pray. And the message is, if you're fighting the prophets at praying, you should run. Because as soon as he's finished praying, he manages to slay Amlici there in verse 30 and 31. You see his prayer, and God answers it.
Well, even in verses 18 and 28, Mormon relates to us that the Lord strengthened the hand of the Nephites because theirs was the just cause. They were the ones who were attempting to live the gospel and establish the Church of Christ. And so
you'd think at the end of the history of the Nephites, if they would have been reading their large plates, they could have read this account and realized, you know what, if we want access to powers of heaven, we better make sure that we're on God's side.
That's a really interesting note you say that, because as I'm reading this, I always think of Pahoran, who struggled later to go against his own people. You wonder, if he had had this, he would have said, well, I've seen the prophet do this. But he struggled, and he needed some encouragement to do that. Maybe because of the magnitude or different circumstances.
As he's doing this abridgment, you get the feeling that Mormon, he spends a lot of time in chapter 3 talking about how the Amlicites had marked themselves. Did you catch, why is that so important to Mormon?
You know, I think in some ways, as you're reading along in this story and the idea, there's a certain rationale with regard to the Nephites who have now shifted sides and why they're marking themselves. There's a practicality when you go into battle that we're going to need to differentiate between the two Nephite groups. And hence we're going to have to somehow identify that we've shifted sides and we're fighting with the Lamanites. But the application of that is obvious, is that people who have made certain choices outwardly oftentimes mark themselves. There is a specific way that they portray themselves to public, to the outside world. And this is that choice that they've made.
As Mormon is abridging this, I always kind of chuckle when I read places where he abridges a portion of the record, then he can't help himself. He has to interject something that just to make sure we don't miss the point. For example, after talking about how the Amlicites marked themselves in verse 18, Mormon just interjects this. Now the Amlicites knew not they were fulfilling the words of God. We'll see that several other times in the chapters ahead. That Mormon just gets so excited and he wants to make sure we got the message. So he says, "Now, did you catch this? They didn't know that. That's too bad they didn't know." In that particular instance, the numbers that were slain, huge numbers of people. This is I read this. You get the feeling there's a cost, a spiritual cost of this kind of warfare.